Well, today we're going to be talking for the last week, really, about an empiricist approach to philosophy. And we're getting to one of the most fundamental questions of philosophy, one of the biggest questions. Is there a God? Now, you might have thought that an empiricist would be inclined to say no, because after all, the empiricist says that all our knowledge comes from experience, and we don't directly experience God. And so you might think, well, I don't see how that's really possible to explain any religious knowledge on the basis of an empiricist starting point. But it's not so simple. A number of philosophers who are empiricists have thought not only that God exists, but actually have thought that they have an argument for the existence of God. Aristotle is one of those, Aquinas is another, John Locke yet another. And so we're going to look at one of those arguments today, and another argument next time. Actually, I should really say, it's often called one argument, the cosmological argument, but it's really something like a family of arguments, and we're going to see a variety of versions of it today. Before we get to the details of the arguments, though, let's think about that question of whether or not there is a God. What do we mean when we ask that question? What do we mean by God? Now, probably anyone, whether they believe in God or not, has some image of what you're talking about when you discuss belief in God. And so you may well have some concept of God, some idea, some image in your mind. What is part of that concept? What is that image that you might have in your mind? Yeah.
I think the most general one is just a higher power that's responsible for creating the world.
Ooh, a higher power responsible for creating the world. That is going to be the particular property of God that the cosmological argument focuses on, God's role as creator, and argues for a divine creator of the world. Are there other parts of the concept of God? Yeah.
All-knowing, all-seeing.
Okay, all-knowing, all-seeing. Other things. Gosh. I say, is there a God? And you say, who?
That's judgmental.
Ooh, an image of God as judgmental, as judging people, as judging things. Other aspects, yes?
Infinite.
Infinite. Good. Yeah.
The force determines our path in life.
The force that determines our path in life. Other ideas. Yes.
I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but I imagine a really big bearded guy.
He imagines a really big bearded guy. Okay? Yes, big sort of flowing robes and so on. Well, actually, so does Homer Simpson. But in general, you might say, there are different concepts of God. Whatever mental image, if you have a mental image that you might have, there's a way of understanding God that goes under the heading of classical theism. It is the way that classically philosophers have tended to think about God. So, the classical conception of God is of a being who is omnipotent, all-powerful, omnipresent, exists everywhere, is omniscient, all-knowing, okay, all-seeing as one of you put it, eternal, everlasting, is infinite in that sense, but also in the sense of having infinite expanse, infinite in power, infinite in knowledge, and so on, is transcendent, is in some way beyond the world, is not just the world itself, but is some higher power, as one of you put it, something beyond the world itself. And then is a conscious being, is compassionate, for example, caring, perhaps is judgmental, has attitudes, in other words, is a conscious being. Is not just an impersonal force. In any case, those are the characteristics that tend to go along with a classical idea of what God is. And so the argument is often about whether such a being exists or does not exist. But there are alternative conceptions. And so it's worth talking about some, you might call them dissonant conceptions, conceptions of God that are not classical and are minority positions in the philosophical tradition, but nevertheless are present, and in some traditions throughout the world are significant. One is, I don't know if you can exactly call this a conception, it's almost the absence of a conception. It's called the via negativa, and it's been especially appealing to a variety of mystics. It's the negative way of thinking about what God is. So all you can say is that God is not. God is not this, God is not that. God is wholly other. So according to this conception, God just transcends anything we're capable of thinking. Even to call God infinite or to call God all-knowing, all-powerful, those are thought to be in some way limiting to God. And so on this conception, God really cannot be defined, but simply has to be experienced. And some mystics will say, I can't tell you what an experience of God is like. All I can do is try to point you in a direction, and if you have the experience, then you will know what I'm talking about. Deism is the view that God created the world, but then has had no further interaction with it. So God, whatever the characteristics of God might be, certainly very great, even if not perfect, and infinitely powerful, and so on, nevertheless was powerful enough to create the world, but after that, really doesn't exhibit any interaction with the world, isn't particularly compassionate or whatever, just is a kind of force behind creation. Another conception is pantheism. Pantheism simply identifies God with nature. Essentially says God is the totality of everything. So you are part of God, so am I, so is the table, so is the chair. Everything is really a part of God. God is simply that totality of all the things that exist. God is just all the existing things taken together. And a final conception, which has a weirder name, but nevertheless is, I think, more commonly found in pantheism, is called panentheism. And that is the view that God includes everything. That is to say that God does include the world, so we are all parts of God. But nevertheless, God also transcends the world, goes beyond the world. And so God is like a whole of which the world is merely a part. Now, those conceptions are, as I mentioned, in the Western tradition, relatively minority positions. In some Eastern religious traditions, they are very significant. Well, let's take a look at this question of the existence of God and think about whether there are a posteriori arguments that can be given about whether God does or does not exist. A posteriori because, after all, according to the empiricist, all knowledge about the world depends on experience. And so we need an argument that would be an argument from experience toward the existence or non-existence of God. So that's what we're in quest of this time and next time. We're looking for arguments based on experience that would lead us to the conclusion that God does or does not exist. So the ones we're going to be focusing on today have to do with this idea of God as creator. The idea behind the cosmological argument is that it's really about an explanation for the cosmos, the universe. And the idea is of God as a creator of the universe. So here is one way of starting out with an overview of a few different versions. Aristotle talks about God as being the prime mover of the universe, the first being who moves and actually causes anything else to happen. Aquinas talks about God as being the first cause, the cause that originates the universe and every other cause. And then Avicenna talks about God as the necessary being, the being that has to exist, whereas everything else in the universe is really contingent. It might or might not have existed, but God, of course, had to exist necessarily. God is not contingent or dependent on anything. Now, those give us already three slightly different versions of the cosmological argument. Here is the simplest form of this argument I've ever found. It is in the Nyaya Vaisheshika tradition, in Udayana, for example, in Indian philosophy, and it goes like this. The earth is in effect like a pot. Therefore, it has a pot. But of course, we don't literally mean the earth here. We have to understand the universe. The universe is in effect like a pot. So, of course, there must be a potter. There must be a creator of the universe. Well, that is the core of the cosmological argument. On the other hand, stated that baldly, you might have some objections. So what's your reaction to that argument? Yeah. Okay, good. One thing you might worry about is that premise, that the universe is an effect. What if the universe simply sprang into existence spontaneously? Then you might say, well, gosh, why is it like a pot? That seems in a sense to beg the question. Once I say it's an effect, then yeah, of course it has a cause, but why should I believe it has an effect? The conclusion's already built in a way that should make me suspicious if I doubt whether the universe has a cause. Other reactions to this argument? Yeah?
So, the Big Bang Theory argument, doesn't the Big Bang Theory say there's some, it's from very tiny stage, right? And then it expands, right? So there must have been something. So something still needs to be created even for the Big Bang Theory.
Well, okay, yes. If you think about the Big Bang, you might say, well, what if we say this? The universe was the result of the Big Bang. So the Big Bang is the cause. But the Big Bang isn't God, right? I mean, it'd be very weird to study physics and say, where are you going? To do your homework? No, I'm going to pray to the Big Bang. That would be bizarre, right? And so you might think, look, that's another way of saying, well, maybe the Earth is an effect, but that its cause could be identified with God. That's another question. Yeah?
It's worth pointing out, first of all, that the Big Bang was discovered by a Catholic priest named Father Macho. Also,
all right, good.
I find bizarre about the objectives, the cosmological argument, is the idea that something could be nothing, which is what GK Chesterton. It's absurd to say that nothing should turn itself into something.
Ooh, all right, good. Good. A lot of people frame this argument in the following way. Surely something can't just come out of nothing. What would it mean that there was nothing? And then all of a sudden, boom, spontaneous creation. That would be very, very weird. If you think that couldn't happen, then you think the universe must have had something that caused it. And so, yes, I mean, what we're really finding out is that this argument is so compressed that a lot of very important underlying principles and underlying theses are really being left out. Yeah?
I think this really simple statement kind of has a false conclusion, because in the way I see it, it's like saying a cup is knocked over, therefore someone knocked it over. So it's like, well, a variety of other things could have happened for the cup to knock over. It could have been the wind, it could have been a dog that kicked it over. Like, it's kind of like, it's rooting to effect from one cause instead of a variety of causes.
Okay, so one way of looking at your objection would be to say this. Just as a cup knocked over, it might have been knocked over by a person or by a dog or the wind or an earthquake or something. So maybe the earth sprang into existence from some kind of cause or other, but it doesn't tell us which cause. So if we've got that the universe had a cause, even granting the premise, we get and the conclusion, actually, you might say, well, yes, but I don't see the religious significance of this because I don't know which cause it has. Maybe there are many possible causes, and until I find out that I can say with any confidence that the cause must have been divine, I don't know really what to conclude from this. Yeah?
My first thing is, how did the cause come into being? And then my second thing is, this is really broad. So it's like saying, Bonnevac is a man. Okay, you are a man, that's not wrong. But there's a lot more to you, and there's a lot more that we need to know about you in order to listen to you or to, interact with you. So
Okay, good.
too broad and what caused this specific cause to create her.
Okay, nice point, actually. Suppose the earth is in effect like a pot and does have a cause. You could start saying, well, what about that cause? Does that cause have another cause? And so on. And we're very quickly going to be led into a situation where, like, what if that cause had another cause, and so on and so forth. And so, as we'll see, very quickly these arguments get to deal with the question of infinity and infinite series of causes. Yeah?
Yeah, like you said, like it's like these arguments just kind of go into like goalpost moving. Like the pot isn't like this standalone object born out of nothing. It's made out of earth. That earth was already there. The potter simply crafted it. The earth as a result of the creation of the universe. So then the person could say, oh, well, then, God shaped this matter that was already there.
Right.
And it's just constant goalpost moving in this argument.
All right, that's a really interesting point. Notice that a pot does have a cause, the potter, but is also made out of stuff that was already there. The potter doesn't create the stuff, the clay, let's say, that goes into forming the pot. That was already there. And so to the extent that we take the analogy seriously here, it implies this picture of God finding this stuff around and then shaping it into the universe. And that is exactly the way some philosophers think about this. But from most perspectives, that's an odd way of looking at things. I mean, where'd that other stuff come from? And if it really is a question of God shaping matter, was matter then eternal? Is matter somehow separate from God, foreign to God? So anyway, it can raise lots of questions if we take this analogy very seriously. Yeah?
Like what she said about like how like anything could have made the earth. Couldn't that just be like wouldn't that lead to one of the conclusion could be that it was on accident? So like we were created on accident. Like if like the cause of an accident.
Ah, right. Okay, good. Causes are not always intentional causes. And so what if there was a cause, but it was accidental? Could have been maybe something natural, but it might have even been God, right? God sneezed out of the world. Sorry. I've got a cold, so actually this idea of sneezing out of world seems horrifyingly plausible. But anyway, there are actually traditions. The Gnostic tradition is one where the creation of the universe happens more or less like that. It is not an intentional creation. It's kind of this byproduct of a weird thing that happens among divine beings. It's an accident. It's not that anybody says, let me create a world. It's rather something happens and somebody cries and, the world happens. So yeah, I mean, you might think, well, even if this points us toward divine beings, it may tell a really different story from that told by most major religions. Yeah?
What about if everything that we observe is the kind of thing that can't make itself, and can we infer the presence of something that is not like that and can make itself? Like.
Okay, yes. Here's a way of trying to defend the argument. You might say, look, we have experience with things that cannot make themselves. For example, this table. Does anybody think this table just spontaneously came into being? That it somehow crafted itself? Or that another table made this table? No, it had a craftsman, right? And so actually next time we're going to look at a different family of arguments, the design arguments, that say that, look, the universe is like a table. In that respect, like a pot, it's the object of design. It's something that was intentionally created and designed by somebody for a purpose. Well, so far we've been talking about a very, very simple, crude form of this argument. Let's look at a more sophisticated version. This is from Aquinas' Summa Theologica. The second way is based on the nature of causation. In the observable world, causes are to be found ordered in series. We never observe, or even could observe, something causing itself, for this would mean it preceded itself, and that's impossible. So, there are a series of causes. Now, such a series of causes must stop somewhere. For in all series of causes, an earlier member causes an intermediate, and the intermediate causes a last, whether that intermediate is just one or many different causes. If you eliminate a cause, you also eliminate the effects. Therefore, there can be neither a last nor an intermediate cause unless there is a first. But if the series of causes goes on to infinity, and there is no first cause, there would be neither intermediate causes nor a final effect which is patently false. So, he says, it is therefore necessary to posit a first cause, which all call God. Well, let's take a look at the form of this argument in a way that is a little bit, I think, clearer to follow. Let's let A be the current state of the world. A is just how things are right now. Well, that's the result of something. That was caused by a previous state of the world. Let's call that B. That was caused by a previous state of the world. Let's call that C. That was caused by a previous state. Call it D, and so on. Now the question is whether that can go on to infinity, or whether there had to be a beginning. Could you have this backward, infinite series of causes? Now he says there couldn't be. And he gives us, in my opinion, a sort of, well, if there wasn't a first cause, there couldn't have been intermediate ones. But you might say, look, but there was always one before, right, in this infinite series. So one way of looking at his argument is to say, but how would that series have ever gotten started? Another way to look at it that I personally find a little more compelling intuitively is to say, how did we ever get here? If there's a beginning to the universe, then you can see how we've gotten here. This is the year 2017. Or, stardate 4792 or whatever it is, you can sort of say, okay, there is some sort of progression. I see how we got here. But what if infinitely many things had to happen before we got here? How could we ever be here? Infinitely many things would already have to occur. And that's hard to get your mind around. So he says in the end, there must have been a first cause. It couldn't have gone back forever. Now, in the other direction, it's not so problematic. You could imagine at least a universe that just went on forever, each state causing the next state and so on. But to go backwards in time, he says that doesn't make any sense. How could you ever have gotten to any point in that series? Before, no matter how far back you go, you'd have to already have done infinitely much before you even got there. So, in short, there must be a first cause. And he says, and everybody calls that God. Now, that's a somewhat more sophisticated version of the argument. It brings out this idea, both that something couldn't have come from nothing, and also that there couldn't be this infinite series of causes. So it's much more explicit than the simple Nyaya argument. On the other hand, you might say it also seems puzzling in a couple of ways. So, reactions to this argument. Yeah?
So whenever he says the first cause was God, is he being an actual deity, or is he just calling the cause God?
All right, good. Here are two ways of taking that. Hey, everybody calls it God, right? It could be a stipulative thing, or it could be actually making a substantive claim. Here's one way. What I mean by a stipulation is you just introduce a name. Hey, I've argued there must have been a first cause. I'm going to call it God. Okay? And then somebody says, I think it was the Big Bang. So good, the Big Bang is God. And so that it could be just by stipulation. But more, really, that's not what he's doing, I think. He has an idea of God, which is the classical conception. And so he thinks, no, that being is the first cause. Now, we don't yet have any argument for why we should identify that first cause with that being independently understood. That's a substantive claim. You can't just say, oh, everybody calls it God. No, there's a real substantive issue there, that first cause is to be identified with the being who is all-powerful, all-knowing, omnipresent, and so on and so forth. And that we haven't yet got. Yeah?
If it was like, I'm just sort of transferring like the infinity over to a graph, what if you have a sine curve, and the sine curve is infinite, but there's definite like points in the sine curve where things repeat. So there's like intervals of time where you can approach something. So maybe we're just on like one little hump of the sine curve, when you can look back at the previous hump of the previous part of the sine curve.
Ah, okay, good. Yeah, there were, oh, now I want to draw a sine curve. Okay, so suppose we do that, and we think, look, this goes off infinitely in both directions, so it's, dot, dot, dot here, dot, dot, dot there. Now, what would that mean here? Aquinas is saying, well, look, I don't think it could go back infinitely far in this direction if we're thinking about causes. What sense would it make? However, there have been theologians who have proposed something like this. For example, Origen has the idea that the universe is created, expands, then contracts, ends, but then does it again. Actually, some physicists think of that happening. There's a big bang after a big crunch. And the universe is like this accordion that just does this sort of thing infinitely. It's kind of interesting that a 3rd century theologian already had that basic idea. But if you have that thought, then wait a minute, this universe is just like this segment of the sine curve, and then the rest, is just a repetition of a similar sort of universe, and but now, Aquinas would say, well, wait, could that go back infinitely? Could we really be in the infinite universe, in the big crunch, big bang scenario? And his claim would be no. So I do think there's an idea in what you're saying, and indeed, if you think about curves like this, or just the number line, positive and negative numbers, we don't have any trouble thinking about negative numbers. That goes back infinitely in the negative direction. So why is causation different? And that's a real challenge. A lot of philosophers have been unconvinced by this argument of Aquinas' that it couldn't have. So we've got a couple of real issues here. One is, why couldn't that chain go back infinitely far? It's going to be crucial whether we think of expanding and contracting universes or just one universe that goes back infinitely. The question is, well, why did it have to have a first cause? Why really cannot we have an infinite backwards causal chain? But then, that second problem we've already identified, if there is a first cause, how should we argue for the fact that that's actually God, that is a being that is all-knowing, all-powerful, infinite, transcendent, and so on? And it's not clear how we do that. Here is the version of the argument we find in Avicenna, a philosopher in the Islamic tradition. He's also inspired by Aristotle, as Aquinas is. Aristotle, by the way, has a very complicated version of this argument that crucially depends on the heavenly bodies moving in perfect circles, which is why I'm not talking about it. But Avicenna simplifies it greatly, in a different direction, however, from the one Aquinas uses. So he puts the argument this way. There is in being a being which has no reason for its being. Now, Avicenna always writes like that, so it's not the most fun thing to read. But here's the basic idea. What is contingent can't enter upon being except for some reason, which sways things in favor of its being and against its not being. Well, if that reason is also contingent, then there's a chain of contingents linked one to the other, and there is no being at all. For this being, which is the subject of our hypothesis, can't enter into being, so long as it's not preceded by an infinite succession of beings, which is absurd. Therefore, contingent beings end in a necessary being. This really takes the idea of causation in time and makes it a question of dependence, thinking about one thing being contingent on another, depending on another thing for its reason for being. Well, here I'm just quoting Avicenna, so that's a little terrifying, but here's the core of the argument. Say that something has a reason for its being, if and only if, and by the way, philosophers and logicians use that IFF to mean if and only if, so that we don't have to write that out all the time. So get used to that, it's not a misspelling. Suppose everything were contingent. Well then, one thing would be linked to another in this infinite chain. I, for example, my being would be contingent, and indeed it surely is highly contingent. I mean, I easily could not have existed. But it turns out that I would be dependent on something, that would be dependent on other things, and so on and so forth, and that chain would go back infinitely far. But he said then infinitely many beings would have to be there. Infinitely many reasons would have to hold in order for me to even exist. But that's absurd. I'd depend on an infinite series of things. Nothing would ever exist at that rate. So there's got to be something that's necessary. This idea that everything is contingent doesn't in the end make any sense. Well, reactions to that argument. Yeah.
So the idea of like purpose is similar to like how people believe like God has a plan, something like that.
Okay, that's an interesting point. What exactly do we mean by dependent, having a reason for its being? We could just mean cause, and then it becomes very much like Aquinas' argument. But you're right, we could mean purpose. We could mean something that is the goal here, as being the thing it depends on. My being here, for example, depends on my having this job and my teaching this class. Just today I found out that a class I had planned to teach in the spring probably won't happen. And now it's like, ooh, so what do? Anybody need a class to be taught? I'm sort of in the position of being a beggar. And that's a kind of weird thing, right? That was contingent on certain things, and it turns out those aren't holding, and so boom. And if you might think, that has to do with, now, not just a cause, but in this case, a purpose and a goal, and that could be a reason too. So reason here is a broader notion. It might have to do with future-oriented things, goals, purposes, and so on, as well as things from the past, like causes. Well, there is, let's don't talk about that. It's cool, but complicated. So, here is Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali is a really interesting figure. He was a university professor who was a skeptic in the Islamic tradition. He thought that Al-Farabi and Avicenna, who had come before him, were much too confident in their metaphysical positions and metaphysical arguments, and he attacks them. Reading Al-Ghazali is a little bit like reading David Hume in the Western tradition. He's kind of a skeptic who debunks arguments from his competitors. And actually became so convinced of his own skeptical arguments that he became a Sufi mystic and gave up his position. And ended up just writing poetry after writing some works of philosophy. In any case, he's a delight to read. And his argument is this. This whole cosmological argument, whether you find it in Aquinas' form about causes, or in this broader form as in Avicenna about reasons, which could be future or past oriented, that's something that depends on the impossibility of an infinite chain of dependencies, an infinite chain of causes going back in time. But he says, why is that impossible? Why can't we think about negative numbers or sine curves and think about the whole history of the world is going back infinitely? It does mean that infinitely much stuff happened by now. But he says, I don't see the absurdity in that. Why is that impossible? And in fact, he gives an argument about why you can't have an argument like that. He says, look, any argument like that to show that it's impossible to have this infinite chain of causes would have to be either a priori or a posteriori. So it either has to be based on concepts independently of experience, or it has to be based on experience. Could it be based on concepts independently of experience? His answer is no, and actually the sine curve or negative numbers show that. There's no conceptual impossibility about an infinite succession of things, even extending into the past. It's not like you say, there's a contradiction in the idea. It doesn't seem as if there's a contradiction in the idea. In fact, those mathematical models give you an idea of what it would be like. Could it be based on experience? Could it be a posteriori? Well, he says no, because, and now there's a very clever move. He says the necessary being could just be that backward infinite series of contingent beings. So, in effect, he's saying this. Suppose the universe went back infinitely. Maybe you've got an argument that there is a necessary being. But what if that necessary being isn't God? It's just the existence of that causal chain. Whether it's finite or infinite, that would be like, okay, everything depends on the whole of which it's a part. That's a little weird, but he thinks that, nevertheless, you might just have an argument that there had to be something or other, but whatever happened, oh well, let's just call that whole sequence the necessary being. Maybe each one of those things was contingent, but that there had to be something going on. Maybe that's just the necessary thing you're pointing to. I think one way of interpreting this is to say, look, this allows for the possibility of pantheism. We could just be identifying God with nature. We could just take the necessary being to be nature as a whole, in which case the argument isn't very interesting. Well, Averroes responds in a way that I think is actually interesting. Averroes is the last in this series of great Islamic philosophers from the Middle Ages, and he argues that there are two kinds of agent. Because what he does, actually this is great, Al-Ghazali writes a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, in which he is arguing that none of the philosophers make any sense. And Averroes writes a much longer book called The Incoherence of the Incoherence, in which he claims that Al-Ghazali is getting it all wrong. Averroes is an utterly brilliant philosopher, but the book is long and very difficult. If Al-Ghazali is a great writer whose work is very accessible and you can easily see what he's thinking, Averroes takes real work. It's hard. But here is the core, I think, of his response. He says, look, there are two senses of causation here. And I've already been talking about this. One of them, which has to do with events preceding one another in time, our ordinary idea of efficient causation. Okay, in that case, he says, the agent to which the object which proceeds from it is only attached during the process of its becoming, but the object becomes independent afterwards. So, for example, whoever made this table, the table no longer depends on it, right? They were the cause of the table's existence, that woodworker, let's say. But on the other hand, now that that table has been produced, here it is. The same thing is true of your cell phone. Whoever made that cell phone, you don't continue to be dependent on them. he said while awaiting next update from Apple. Maybe you do, in which case it's the second kind. It's a dependence where actually the cause and the thing being caused are dependent. That if you took away that cause, the thing would no longer be. So for example, a house builder can build a house, then the builder can die, but the house is still there, right? And that's not problematic. That's the first kind of causation. But the second kind, if you mess with the existence of the cause, you mess with the existence of the thing dependent on. So for example, the table. The table is as high as it is, if it's standard, about 30 inches, because its legs are a certain height. But if you change the height of the legs, you change the height of the table. Okay, so there is really a dependence relation there. And sometimes because means one of these, sometimes not. Anyway, one of these senses is the sort of builder to house model where the result is independent. But the other, they're really inseparable. Let's call that kind of inseparable dependence grounding. So we can distinguish ordinary causation, like builder of the table, from grounding. Now, in effect, he says Al-Ghazali's right about efficient causation. Actually, when you think about a causal series of events going into the past, there could be infinitely many, but that's not really that troubling. We don't have any argument against that, so he's right about that. But if we think about this grounding relation, then actually he's wrong. There couldn't be an infinite series of grounds. So essentially he's saying, think about that horizontal thing, one event happening before another. Could that go back infinitely far in time? Well, maybe. I don't have an argument against it in saying. But what grounds that? All that must be grounded in something. Maybe a system of natural laws, let's say. That's got to be grounded in something. That's got to be grounded in something. And that couldn't go back infinitely far, because something that depended on infinite grounds wouldn't actually be grounded at all. There couldn't be an infinite descending grounding series, even if there could be an infinite backwards in time series of efficient causes. So one way of looking at this is just an infinite descending chain of these grounding dependence relations couldn't ground anything. After all, think about it. It would be like, what are you standing on? The floor. What's the floor standing on? The ground underneath. What's the ground standing on? The Earth's mantle. What's that standing on? And it would be very odd to think, oh, it just goes on infinitely. So his claim is it can't go on infinitely. The ultimate ground of everything must be God. There's a similarity to Locke's idea on substance. Since we're late on time, I won't show you that. I will just show you the image. It would be like the Earth resting on the back of a great turtle. And then, what supports the great turtle? Bertrand Russell talks about an old woman in the audience who mythically says, you're not going to get me, sonny, it's turtles all the way down. That doesn't seem to make any sense, and that's Averroes' point.